Cześć, hello, vitam, and welcome to Pierogi to Prayer, the official podcast of St. Joseph's Polish Apostolate of the Diocese of Camden, coming to you from our historic home at 1010 Liberty Street in Camden, New Jersey, the heart of South Jersey's Polonia for over 130 years. I am your host, Michael Matulewicz. All of us have childhood memories that remind us of the formative years of our lives. These are the places and moments in our hearts where we retreat to when we yearn for happier, carefree times. Places inhabited by endless summers and people long since past who live on in the mythical land of memory forever that existed before the responsibilities and struggles of adulthood. In thinking of this time in my own life, my mind always runs to a certain mile-square town nestled in northeastern Pennsylvania. Despite the years that have passed, I still remember vividly the long car rides up and down the increasingly steep terrain to visit my great-grandparents, who I was so fortunate to have known and were so very much a lifeline to the ever-receding past. In this town of Mount Carmel in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, nearly my entire family settled when they immigrated over a century ago from all over historic Poland. Now, given my attachment and involvement with our Polish community here in Camden, New Jersey, this often comes as a surprise to many people that my roots are in fact here in Pennsylvania. Many assume that, like most of the families in our community, I'm the same heir to the same particular grand church building and its history that they are. Now, usually, I'm not one to focus too much on myself in these podcasts. I prefer rather to feature the people we interview or the topics of interest. But given the nature of these topics, and how they oftentimes personally relate to me, it is impossible to not mention my own story. However, this episode, more than almost all others, will be intensely personal due to the contributions of one guest in particular. And such is the relevance that I lead in with my experiences of this particular town. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the industrializing United States needed coal, and no coal was more valuable than the so-called hard coal, known scientifically as anthracite, that eons ago had endowed this small corridor in northeastern Pennsylvania with this sought-after mineral. At the time, mining of this coal required lots of labor, and who best to fill that need than the floods of immigrant peoples that were crossing the Atlantic Ocean from the old world to the new. As we have discussed many times on our program, these peoples brought their distinct individual faiths and customs with them. The newcomers that settled in this region were primarily Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, and dozens of individual denominations sprung up in this region by ethnicity. In Mount Carmel, no less than 6 Catholic churches were established in this 1-mile-square town, each more beautiful than the last, with their spires dotting the landscape. Not one, but 2 Polish ethnic churches anchored each end of the borough. Our Mother of Consolation, known as MOC in the north end, and St. Joseph's to the south. This is, of course, not a unique phenomenon in Polish communities in the United States. Chicago had its St. Stanislaus Kostka and Holy Trinity within sight of each other on Milwaukee Avenue. In Buffalo, St. Stanislaus Bishop and Martyr and Corpus Christi sit only blocks apart. Such factionalism may seem strange to many of us today, as it also did then to those who couldn't or wouldn't try to understand it. But nonetheless, the Mount Carmel Polish experience can serve as something of a case study, not only for the history of this Polish-American past, but for the more recent history of the Church in the United States. For like so many dioceses in the Northeast and the Midwest, the experience of population shifts, decreasing number of priests and attendances, brought about some very painful changes to these historic parishes, beginning in the late 1990s. This reflected a wider church and nation that was very different than the one in which these congregations had first been formed. Today, we have 2 guests, 2 Catholic priests in fact. In the center of our discussion, I situate myself as a layman, and the 3 of us form a triangle of experiences and ethnic backgrounds, similar in age group, but also in our experiences of late 20th century Catholicism's changing landscape. Father Jonathan Sawicki has the same ties to Mount Carmel and the Polish experience there that I do. FatherStephen Robbins is actually our first returning guest to the podcast, having come in August of last year to talk about Our Lady of Częstochowa, an episode which I very much encourage you to go back to listen to whenever you can. Each of us, only a few years apart in age, share our reflections based on faith in general, but also as caretakers of this faith, brought to us by the generations who came before us, and how it has been forced to be reimagined as of late. As you will also soon hear, their ministry to the people of today, some of whom also share our same ethnicity, but most who do not, is a cause for reflection as well, and presents its challenges, but also its opportunities. So good afternoon, Father Jonathan and Father Stephen. Welcome to Pierogi to Prayer. It's so great to have you both on. And as I was thinking about this is the second time that I've had two guests. And the first time was also with you, Father Steve. So you've made an appearance on our program twice now. And it was both with two other people. So, or with one other person. So congratulations on that achievement, right?
Thanks. It's good to be back.
It's great. And for the first time, Father Jonathan, who I would say Sawicki, but as I understood that you go by the anglicized name of Sawicki. So just for our listeners, I did not mispronounce it. I do not take away my Polish card by mispronouncing Sawicki. That being said, that's the disclaimer. So welcome to you.
It's good to be with both of you.
Great. So why don't we just start out by introducing yourselves to our listeners. Where you're joining us from, where you are missioned, where you're stationed, what diocese you're in, and we can go from there. So, Father Jonathan, since you're new, why don't you start?
So, Father Jonathan Sawicki, I'm a priest of the Diocese of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And as I said to Michael before we began recording, my grandfather, Fritz Sawicki, married a wonderful Italian woman named Mary Procopio, and he became Sawicki after that. But we all knew, because we're from the Holy Land, of Pennsylvania, also known as the coal regions of northeastern Pennsylvania, particularly the town of Mount Carmel. And so there's a funny thing that happens, especially in that town of Mount Carmel and that immediate surrounding area, because of the economic factors of the region. A lot of people moved out. So my parents were blessed. We were able to, stay there. We were all raised there. I'm the last of 5 kids, and I've been a priest in this diocese. I was ordained in June of 2009. And but my family roots, much like Michael's, one time I had to ask him, are we related at all? Because that's a question you have to ask him on Carmel. But all of my great-grandparents were immigrants, except one, my paternal great-grandmother. She was actually born in Buffalo, the Polonia in Buffalo, and then they dropped down to Mount Carmel in the 1870s. So our family roots and that awareness of being of immigrant stock, whether it was the Italian and the Polish of my dad's side of the family, or the Russian or Ukrainian side of my mom's family, was very much something that we cherished within our home. And, whether it's a couple of the foods that we keep or just that awareness that, you go to the Polish church for the memorial masses for your great-grandparents, or, it's Velia, but my mom's style. So it'd be a little bit different than the Polish style, but that awareness of something to cherish and hold on to, because it's that thing that you do every year or that time of year. So that's what brings me here.
Yeah, and that's great. And it's just funny because our former pastor was Father Ciechocki, and but he had written it as Ciechocki, and I had Ciechocki family that lived in Mount Carmel. And when he was first stationed at St. Joe's, well, he was stationed at the cathedral, but was at St. Joe's, we were talking, and I said, Father, I have Ciechockis in my family. He said, oh, well, my family's from a little small town up in northeast Pennsylvania, probably not related. And I said, what's the name of the town? And he said, Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania. I said, well, that happens to be where they're from as well. So we had to have that same conversation about being related. But it turned out he was Chihetsky from Koltmont and not Chihotsky from Mount Carmel, which is what we were. But anyway, that being said, it's just so funny how often that shows up. And even we had a previous guest on our program who was from Buffalo, at the Polonia community there, and talked about that experience. So yeah, we all kind of find ourselves one way or the other related in one way, shape, or form, it seems. So, but thank you for that great introduction. And so, Father Steve, now I know you admitted before that you have a little bit of Poland in you, but not a lot. But however you feel to introduce yourself is you're more than welcome.
Sure. Yeah. So, FatherStephen Robbins, I'm the administrator currently of the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Camden, obviously a priest of the Diocese of Camden, which includes St. Joseph's Polish. And I'm also serving as the Associate Vocation Director here in our diocese in South Jersey, born and raised here in South Jersey. And yeah, Michael, like you mentioned, and as I mentioned in my first appearance on this podcast, I do have some semblance of Polish blood. I must confess, I've never done one of those like DNA tests to see like what the percentage breakdowns are of all the national things. But my family very much is kind of American mutt, if you will, of just like a mixture of so many different things. Obviously, my last name is Robbins, which is like a Scotch Irish name. So there's definitely some predominantly Scotch Irish. I certainly look Scotch Irish. But I also have some Italian, some Polish, supposedly some Native American blood, even though we have no documentation to prove that. So just a lot of things kind of mixed up. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. Most of my Polonia knowledge has come from my 4 years being here in Camden thus far and ministering to the people at St. Joseph's. I've learned a lot about Polish culture, Polish American culture, and all those kinds of fun different things. And just a fun connection with Father Jonathan and myself. Well, two fun connections. One, my mom grew up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is not far from where you are. So there's a big time connection there. And then also, Father Jonathan and I happened to meet each other a couple of months ago when I happened to be in the Harrisburg area for a vocation director's event. And he hosted us for a Super Bowl party at his parish. So we happened to meet each other before we knew this like podcast was happening. So it's just kind of a fun, how small the world is, how small the church is, that as it gets larger, it actually gets smaller. And we realize we're all united to one another in a lot of different ways. Yeah. So beautiful thing, and happy to be here.
Great. Well, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm glad that you guys made the connection and that we can kind of sit down and talk about this today. So maybe, because Father Jonathan, you kind of spoke about that a little bit, about this sense of what your heritage was growing up. And so now both of you, I know, you're very much, ministering to the church today. And the church of today, while we contain certain elements of, Polonia of the past, certainly at St. Joe's in Camden, we have this church that was built in the, early 1900s. And has this huge bedrock of history when it comes to what it was, is different in so many ways. And the parish itself, we are with the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, and we have a Spanish Mass at the Cathedral, an English Mass at the Cathedral, and it's kind of become a very diverse congregation and a very diverse church. So, Father Jonathan, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, about kind of how you grew up, maybe how it kind of inferred your vocation, which I think might be interesting as well. And then also, just kind of leading into how you see that in your ministry today.
I was born in 1983, okay? And the coal regions were more stable than they are right now. That area of the anthracite coal region, we still had some decent industry. And Michael, you would know from our own family experience what happened in the Shamokin Mount Carmel area in 1995 vis-a-vis our parishes. And that was a huge consolidation. And the Mount Carmel deanery of the Diocese of Harrisburg, between that famous town of Centralia out through Mount Carmel, Locust Gap, and the Coltman area, we went from 13 Roman Catholic parishes within a very small, drive time from Centralia to Coltmont, 13 to 3 parishes in one weekend back in 1995. And this was kind of traumatic for all of us. And so you hear this and you're 12 years old. It's an interesting thing. You're not quite a teenager yet, but you have this awareness of, whoa, where we went to church every Sunday, where we had our block parties, where, we were altar servers, and people who typically didn't care about their religion, their church was taken away, and it made them, care where they might not have once cared. Okay, it's an interesting thing, nobody, they might not go to church until their church is threatened to be taken away, and then all of a sudden they all have an opinion. Okay, my parents were, my late father and my mother, who's still with us, they're good people and people of justice. And so while they might have been upset, they were never uncharitable. And I noticed this, in retrospect. While they might have disagreed with the way things would happen or consultations would take place, my parents always supported the church. They were, if we said, that stupid bishop, forgive me, they'd say, stop that. Everybody has to make difficult decisions in life. My dad would say stuff like that. And I think those are like seeds of faith of how to deal with in adversity in a charitable way. Okay. But why did these parishes have to close? Of course, there was a tremendous population decline because of the closing of the mines beginning in the 1950s. Really, it was traumatic in the mid-50s. Mount Carmel in the 1950 census might have had 18,000 residents, and then by the 1960 census was like 12,000 residents. It lost a third. Okay, it was debilitating. But then they'd say, we don't have enough priests. And they'd say, you all want your churches, but if you want your churches, you have to pray for vocations. And then you think that's right. If you want this, you have to pray for this. And that stuck with me as a 12-year-old. And I didn't go and say, I want to be the priest, send me off to seminary. But it's that tugging at the heart that didn't go away. So it was in that adversity of our churches closing in Mount Carmel. Thankfully, the beautiful Mother of Consolation, which my great-grandfather, Jan Sawicki, and this is a true story, he helped lay the foundation. Professional builders built this cathedral-style church, stone, twin tower, one clock tower, one bell tower. But Father Ladislas Aleknevich, as the family story goes, he would get a keg of beer each evening, and he'd put it in the middle of where the foundation would be. And he'd said to his parishioners, drink all you want, but dig all you can. And that's how they laid the foundation for this church, which is just still standing today. And Jan Sawicki, I think he came over in 1904. By 1905, they were laying the foundation of that church. I'm thinking, so we hear these stories of your family literally building this place. Something I say to people when they say, well, my grandfather did this. I said, well, what are you doing for the church today? Well, I'm really busy. Like, my great-grandfather came home from the Potts Colliery every day. And now, granted, the priest bribed him with beer. But nonetheless, it got done, and it's still standing today. And that's the thing. Like, you could learn, you could admire the past, but then you have to live it in the future, in the present for the future. So I think those are some of those, that adversity and the importance. Like, you lose your church community, and part of it because you don't have enough clergy. Well, take that into your heart,
Wow. I mean, there's so much that's coming to my mind now because, my family were there at the same time as your family and helped build MOC. And Father Aleknevich had married a couple of them, and he had an interesting life too. He was a missionary, and in Africa, the Holy Ghost Fathers, did their time over there, and I found it was interesting too because his story, just taking him as kind of a case study. Now we're talking about clergy, someone who was a Polish immigrant who dealt with everything that Poland was dealing with in those days. And we talk about it all the time on this program about the partitions. There was no Poland. They were remaking Poland here. And then to be kind of marshaling this group of people in a new world who were working incredibly hard, incredibly dangerous. I mean, my surname, Matalevich, Pavel Matalevich, who was there alongside your great-grandfather building that same church, was killed when he was younger than me. and leaving 4 boys, the oldest of whom was 8, I think. And it was just tragedy upon tragedy. But they were so devoted to their church, but to your point too, also though, about their church was the church on the corner. And if you look at Mount Carmel, there are 4 churches on West Avenue: a Polish, Ukrainian, Italian, and Russian. And that was the church for them. So it's just amazing, having already had that similar story, that I love to hear that. Father Steve, I don't know if you have anything to kind of add in that. I mean, based on your own experience growing up.
Yeah, it's interesting. So something for me that was fascinating, kind of like I mentioned in the beginning, being mixed with so many different kind of ethnic, cultural things led us to really not have any distinctive kind of cultural identity other than that of the suburban American who lives, in the Northeast. So I think growing up, my ecclesial experience, our parochial experience, was very just plain. I don't mean that as like a criticism of it, but there was no particular identity to it. I didn't have that connection to my parish that like my great grandparents built it, because the church was built in the 20th century by the diocese because there were all these people kind of moving to the suburbs. So just kind of grew up with a lot of other like suburban people with our kind of shared American normal culture, if you will. And so kind of discerning my vocation in the midst of all that, what was fascinating for me, and this is where the story gets a little bit similar when you mention these kind of massive scale consolidations in the Diocese of Camden back in probably around 2008 or so, was probably that first round of like us doing like a massive scale, like diocesan level consolidation of parishes, where in like kind of one fall swoop, we went from having like 120 something parishes to 64. Like, and they just kind of smushed all these different parishes together. But for me, I think in many ways, that was the first time I even encountered people of another culture. The church where I was growing up, St. Luke in Stratford, New Jersey, got merged with these 2 other churches. And the one particular one, St. Lawrence in Lindenwold, had a very large Hispanic congregation community. And to that point in my life, I don't think I'd ever encountered like Hispanic people other than just like maybe seeing them in public places. So that was very interesting for me as a 7th grader, I guess, when all of these consolidations took place, and going with my family to the Easter Vigil, for example. And all of a sudden, 3/4 of the congregation or 2/3 of the congregation are Latinos, and the gospel is in Spanish, and the white priest is up in the pulpit like preaching bilingually, and it kind of rocks my world a little bit of, well, this is interesting and this is weird. And I think, I guess, one of the gifts of being young when all that happened is like your mind and experience is still like malleable, and I didn't have this kind of like tradition that I was carrying along that I was defensive about or anything like that. And so I'm kind of like, oh, this is cool. But then other people of my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation for sure, what the heck is the deal with all this Spanish? Like, like this isn't my language. We're in America. Like what's happening here? So yeah, just like the consolidation of churches and encountering people of another culture was kind of a monumental, just kind of mental paradigm shift for me, to bring about this reality of, oh, there are people in America who have a strong ethnic identity that is not just being here, I guess. Just broke a lot of walls down for me and kind of opened me up to a larger worldview, and to realize like that this is a thing that was very foreign to my experience, not just the countries they were coming from, but the experience of identifying with a people beyond just like your individual family unit, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting, different perspective, but similar in a lot of ways, I think, to, that experience of Father Jonathan. And I'm also interested, when you're talking about how your parents were still faithful to sort of the church. And I remember there being a lot of brokenness when those consolidations happened on Mount Carmel, and people saying, within my own family, saying not nice things about the bishop. And I still remember Nicholas Datillo, right? Wasn't that his name? Yeah.
Nicholas Datillo.
Yeah, I remember his name his being called by his first name and not being very nicely spoken about. I'm curious a little bit more about how that kind of manifested within your family and the people you know in the communities, because for me it seemed like it was a big it was really upsetting for
It,
everyone.
when it was going down, and I have pictures somewhere up home at my mom's house of, the final mass of St. Paul's Chapel in Atlas, which is it was a chapel at ease, if you will, because again, there were so many Catholics up there, and there were enough priests to serve all these places. And the people crying, and I'm thinking St. Paul's was the newest of the parishes, okay, or newest of the worship sites. So by 1995, that chapel started in 1929. There were people who remembered the dedication. My grandmother, my Italian grandmother, was there when it was blessed. Okay, so they built this. It wasn't an outside force. They built it. The last mass, okay, tears on our back porch, okay, which from Atlas overlooked where the train tracks used to be, and all you heard were bells ringing, because at Mother of Consolation they rang the bells 100 times during that last mass. They told it 100 times for the 100 years that Mother of Consolation Church was in existence as the parish. St. Peter's, they were just tolling the bells. The Slovak church, and you could hear them, echoing in that valley. And then my dad said, "Listen to that, son. It's the last time you're going to hear all this, because you're going to lose a lot of these parishes that weekend." It's like, wow. And we had a flag right next to our chapel. And this is the thing where faith and culture intermix, because Atlas was if you were not Roman Catholic in Atlas, you were Russian Orthodox. If you're not Catholic, you're either Roman Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic, Greek Catholic, or you were Russian Orthodox. You could count the amount of non-Catholics probably on one hand. It's just the way it happened, okay? Now, I might be exaggerating it a little bit, but as a kid, that's like everybody. Like, well, they don't go to our church because they go to the Irish church, okay? Or they walk into town because they go to the Slovak church, all right? And they walk past, to get to the Slovak church, they had to walk past the chapel and Mother of Consolation and St. Peter's to get to St. John's, okay? I when I've shown people maps, I said, "You're kidding me." Like, no, we had three Roman Catholic parishes in basically a 2-block area, plus the Ukrainian Catholic parish. And imagine in the 50s, when my parents would have been in grade school, each one had a school. Even the Ukrainians had a school with convents. For a sister serving the Immaculate Heart of Mary, Sister Teresa Vincent Kozlowski, at her Golden Jubilee, the priest who preached it said, when young Angela Kozlowski was growing up in Mount Carmel, I've factored in that there would have been this many convents and approximately 67 religious sisters, not counting the Carmelite nuns who were in the monastery on the avenue. It's like, in 1 square mile. In 1 square mile. But as the tragedy, the sadness, that fall, there were people saying, we should have done this long ago. We have a choir again. And we were saying, we don't have to serve every other Sunday. We had to serve once a month or once every 5 weeks. We could have replacement altar servers. My gosh, we have a youth choir. And then, for the kids, for us young kids, when we had the picnic in the park, and there was like a youth gathering between the 2 parishes in Mount Carmel, Our Lady's, which served the east side, and the former St. Joseph's Polish Church, and then the Locust Gap, Locust Dale, and Centralia, and the Irish German parish, and then us kids on the west end. And you had like 70 kids got together. Like, this never happened before. And like the kids got over this because they're like, wait, we're going to school with each other at Holy Spirit or in religious ed. But we had our own individual parishes, and the average age of the choir was like 70 in each one of the parishes. Well, then you get it together, and all of a sudden, it's like, wow, we focused on what we gained there, okay? And I think that was always an important thing when you get through that tragedy or that sadness of losing what we once had. So, and it was then cherishing, like, what did we pick up? What great gift did we pick up instead of it? And it was a vibrancy, okay? People say this, like they'll say this 30 years after those mergers, like, oh my gosh, we're so great, they're sad. They miss their old church. The Italians miss not having Tu Scendi della Stella sung at midnight mass. People will still talk about that. Okay. Um, but they focus on what they got,
It's so funny you telling these stories because I was born in '87, so I'm a few years younger than you. But on the other side of Mount Carmel, I was in St. Joseph's that day, and I remember hearing the bells ringing for the last time. Bell, one of which was donated by my family, and the same sentiment of this is the last time you will hear them. And I think you kind of answered it, but it's I think the difficult thing of it too was that for people who came to this country when they didn't have home countries, that was the sense of their home again, losing it, and it is so painful. But it's just, and that's why I'm glad to kind of have this conversation with you guys too, because it's it was kind of an older church and then a more modern church that we're dealing with now, just in this country, like what became a kind of uniquely American version of Catholicism. But then there's people at St. Joe's in Camden, like we have, that kind of still want to hold on to that. It's just, I don't know. I don't really know what the if there's a question there or not, but and it's something that I think just trying to grapple with is difficult. But it is, like, to your point about clergy shortage and people shortage, like that is the church ultimately, is the people and the priests that serve them. And it's, if they're not there, you kind of don't have it anymore.
Yeah. I think that, as Catholic Christians, we're against euthanasia. Okay. So we'd rather not kill off if it's working, and if it's, where it can be, where it's serviceable in any church with like an ethnic element in these United States, that this in our union, right? If it's there, I don't think the church leadership should be artificially saying, no, there's no place for you anymore. They said, but there has been. Can't you just you're Americans now, sing St. Louis Jesuits music? Okay. And I'll tell you, these were some mistakes that were made in Mount Carmel in the aftermath of, because let's face, like, how many of our Polish American parishes who are multi-generational, not just the ones that are fresh immigrants, but the ones who are more historically rooted, like, it's like Serdecznie Matko. Okay. And that's like, well, I love my Polish music. Well, name me 3 pieces. One of them's not Serdecznie Matko. And they're like, you know what I'm saying? Okay. But we did have a pastor in Mount Carmel who said, no, we're not doing any of the ethnic stuff anymore. We have no ethnicity here whatsoever. Well, that was really short-sighted. And this, when I was a young seminarian, thought, well, we shouldn't have any ethnicity anymore. And we should be helping these new immigrants. There should not be a Vietnamese mass in Harrisburg or in Lancaster. There shouldn't be Spanish masses taking place in Shenandoah or in Lebanon or Lancaster. Why do they have that and ours was taken away from us? Okay. Now that just, the arrogance of youth, that got out of me in a mission study abroad in Mexico, and the awareness of what pastoral needs really are, and how we could truly hold on to heritage in a modern setting while not pretending to hold on to a past, but just cherishing that in the present, because it is the identity. Singing Serdecznie Matko, or an English translation of that in a funeral for people who don't speak Polish anymore, but they know the melody because it just hits to their core, right? So how are these ways that we could bridge the past to the present? Because it really nourishes their souls, and it keeps them Catholic. It helps keep them in the fold. It helps keep them in that Catholic and cultural identity united into one.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, and I thought that was really well said and really beautifully said. Right, like, the reason why these things matter and why our heritage matters is because it's all about the Lord, right? Like that's why we have these churches. That's why the church is a thing at all, right? It's about following Christ, and he's alive, and he comes to us where we are in the context of cultures, in the context of ethnicities, in the context of like the languages that we speak. He makes himself known to us, like in the places where we are, making himself known in reality. And so that's why we preach to people in the languages they know, because that's how like Jesus is coming to meet them. And so then where we can get tripped up in all of this then is when our focus diverts away from him, and then our ethnicity becomes the end in itself. And then when things change, there's like this great grief, because we're like, wait, you're taking everything from me. It's like, well, actually, like if it's about the Lord, it's about the Lord. But so that's where it's interesting how keeping it the focus on Christ both embraces the cultural and ethnic things, but then also keeps us from making them the end in themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And it's interesting for me too, because in delving into the history of Polish Catholicism and Catholicism in the United States even, and, sort of these other ancillary, parts of it, there was such an element of it. And even you'll see this today in Poland, where someone referred to this before I heard in an interview, that Polish Catholicism, it was like there was a checklist of things you did. It was almost like there was a magic formula that you said these prayers, you did these devotions. It was like, but there was a real, not a depth of spirituality there. And as someone who is a spiritual director, was ruined thoroughly by the Jesuits, it's a sense of where, when I really discovered my faith, it was within that context of Polish Catholicism, but none of that was presented to me in the church that I knew. And it wasn't until I really engaged with that my faith deepened. And like, to your point, Father Steve, I mean, that's what the church is all about. And for it to be so tied up in all of this history and all this pain that the Poles experienced, I think that was what it was. It was, even if they didn't know the language anymore, they still understood the pain, and it was still there. And then it was like, oh, well, the Irish hated us when we got here anyway, and now they're taking our churches away. When the reality was quite different. Of course, we can talk more about that if you guys want to, but I do want to get to the component of ministering to immigrants today, and sort of, because again, like, Father Jonathan and me, kind of a different generation, Father Steve, but nonetheless, we are living in a church that is much different than it was, or maybe not. So I'm kind of curious now, one way or the other, we know kind of how the sort of turn of the century Catholicism was for the Poles or whoever else, but the immigrant groups that we have today in the church, and a lot of it's kind of been, in the news in a sense. What, in your experience, what has been your experience in ministering to these immigrant communities? What differences do you see? Are you still putting a keg of beer in the middle of a construction project, Father Jonathan, or not? I'm just curious.
Well, on that note, it's funny. So I was when I was ordained a priest, when I was in seminary. My first 4 years were at Overbrook, St. Charles Borromeo in Philadelphia, and then my second 4 years were at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, which is now being led by a marvelous Camden priest, Father Mike Romano, the new rector over there. He's 1 year in. At the Mount, I was asked to go study Spanish in Mexico. And Father, vocation director at the time, said to me, would you like to do this? And I thought, like, I'm the whitest guy in seminary. I'm from the coal region. Like, I don't think I'm particularly gifted in languages. I didn't think so. And I've shared this in the pulpit on Pentecost Sunday 2 years ago. I said, I thought they're in America. They should learn English. My great-grandparents, they learned English. Right? That's what I thought. Yeah, right. And this would have been 2006, and things were ramping up in the United States. I said, should we really be having Spanish masses? Because that's prohibiting these people from being good Americans. We're giving them this stuff, and we're not helping them break out, and well, and I thought this, gosh, if I'm in a Spanish parish, they're going to be in a city, they're going to be a poor parish. And like, I don't want to be in like a ghetto. These are all things that went through my mind. And, I spoke to a priest friend of mine who I tremendously respected, and my fears and these apprehensions. He said, listen, they're asking you to do this. If it's not for you, you could always say it's not for you. So I went to Mexico and I saw how warmly received we were. I went in there with an open mind and I think an open heart. And that was 2006, 2007. I was assigned as a seminarian for a summer in downtown York and South Central Pennsylvania. And at a parish which was heavily Puerto Rican, but also beginning to change, which was a nationally German parish, which was merged in '95 with a small Latino congregation. Okay. And see, I don't know what the diocese was thinking, putting a German parish and a Latino parish under one roof. Okay. Like they're two different understandings of time. Okay. Then when I was ordained a deacon in 2008, I was in a little town, a small town called Gettysburg. I don't know if you've ever heard of the place, which was heavily Mexican. At that time, it was about a quarter Mexican, and then a smattering of Puerto Ricans and other ethnicities. And of course, the old Scots-Irish and Germans who've been there for generations since the battle. And I was blessed to be there with a very wise priest, Father Bernardo Pistone. He actually lives in South Jersey now in an elder care facility near his family. He is a priest of the diocese, an immigrant from Sicily, and so that informed, and he grew up during World War II. And he would say to me, Padrecito, you have to give a place where people can be. At Father Pistone's 50th Jubilee, I said at the homily, I preached his homily, he said, he combined the best characteristics of Niccolo Machiavelli, the Apostle Paul, and Fred Rogers. So you did not want to and he would do this energy and this forcefulness, but this evangelical zeal with this grandfatherliness. Well, you have to give him a place where people can be. And he would defend people. And you know what? This is coming from the gospel. And then I start thinking, because I love history and a big history person within the family, within our diocese. I'm thinking, this is what Father Aleknevich did in helping these Poles build this cathedral on West Avenue, which was organized by a split off. And the other thing is, Mother Consolation was formed in Mount Carmel because the Prussian Poles at the east end of town were rolling their eyes at the Galician and Russian Poles at the west end of town. So they felt like, and I'm thinking, well, they're all Polish. Why can't they just be in one church? Well, because they were from two different experiences, two different educational levels, two different socioeconomic levels. And you start thinking this, it's like, there's nothing new under the sun. And so when I went from being an assistant pastor of Gettysburg to pastor of St. Mary's in York, where I was as a seminarian, whereas in Gettysburg was Little Mexico, St. Mary's York was equal parts Dominican, Salvadoran, Puerto Rican, Mexican. And then people say, well, Father, these are the Mexicans. I said, okay. And they said, in those Mexicans, there was a subset of Mexicans who are basically indigenous Mayans in the Sierra Gorda Mountains. And so there was this awareness, give them a place where they all speak Spanish, but all with a different accent. And not just a different accent, but different palette of food, different way of communicating, different way of shouting. And here's the thing where Father Aleknevich lived, okay? When we were setting up our annual festival, summer festival, I typically had a seminarian with me and I'd reach in my wallet and I'd say, okay, go to Papa John's, get a couple pizzas, and then go to the beer barn and get a case of cold beer. And we're going to break bread with these people who are setting up the picnic stands. And, the one guy said to his Dominican guy, said, Father Jonathan, and he's saying this in English, he said, you don't look like us, but you'll eat with us. Okay. And I think that that's what Christ asks of us, when we're sent with no money bag, no sandals, you're there. You're to immerse yourself and you're supposed to become one with these families that you're serving. It's what was done for our great-grandparents. Okay. We have to do it to them now because those are the people that God is sending to us.
Amen. Wow. No, that's really beautiful. Really well said. I'm just remaining with that. Give them a place where the people can be. And I think being in Camden is a very beautiful experience of that for me as well. I've been a priest for about 4 years now. I'm coming right up on my 4th anniversary. And my whole priestly life has been lived in inner city Camden. But my first few my first few months as a priest, actually, Father Jonathan, you had shared about being sent to Mexico. So when I was growing up in a parish that got merged, had a Hispanic community, was surrounded by that a lot. I remember being in seminary and being very, very inspired by my pastor, may he rest in peace now, Father Joe Capella, who was a very saintly man who had previously been a member of a religious community and had done mission work in Latin America, spoke perfect Spanish. And I remember seeing this super white priest at Holy Thursday, just like going in and out of these two languages seamlessly. And I was like captivated by this and felt my heart really moved as I saw this church full with mostly people who didn't look like me. I've been like, I need to learn this language for missionary purposes. Of like, if there's this many Spanish speaking people in Lindenwold, I can only imagine in the rest of South Jersey, right? So I had expressed a desire to my vocation director, who now is the rector at Mount St. Mary's, Father Mike Romano. And he had kind of set me up with a lot of my summer assignments as a seminarian in places with bilingual communities where I could kind of work a lot with Spanish speaking immigrants, and really loved it. And God gave me a gift to be able to like pick up on the language fairly quickly. And then 2 months before my ordination, my bishop really kind of shocked me with the news of he wanted to send me on mission in Colombia for 3 months immediately following my ordination, kind of for a Spanish immersion experience, but he didn't think I needed any more classes. So he's like, I'm sending you to a diocese where you're going to work in a parish and just like share every aspect of life with these people so that when you come back here, like you're going to be ready for that. So I got sent to a very rural place in the Eje Cafetero of Colombia, which is in the center of the country in a mountainous region in a little pueblo, like this little town called Aguadas. And we had 34 little like villages with chapels that were part of the parish. So my first months as a priest, like, I think I'd said mass in English like a handful of times. And then I'm like just traveling to all these little villages in Colombia. And then coming back to Camden, feeling confident in my Spanish abilities that I've picked up in Colombia, and come to a parish where they're all Puerto Rican and Dominican. So basically learning a new language when I come here, because Caribbean Spanish is a whole different slang, a whole different, dynamic of accents, of cutting different syllables and letters, of like going into the confessional and having people come in, Padre lo que pasa, like, I'm like, oh, are you speaking Spanish? Like, oh yeah, I guess you are. But really beautiful then being in the cathedral parish and looking at all these stained glass windows with the letters of the like donors, like the names of the donors, and they're all Mr. Fitzpatrick, so-and-so, like McHenry, like all these Irish names. And then I'm looking out at this congregation and they're all Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. And then I celebrate the English Mass and there's Africans and Filipinos and second generation Puerto Ricans, and African American people who live in the neighborhood, and a couple old Irish people who have moved out but still come here because this was the parish they grew up in. And being like, Lord, what are you doing here? Like, simultaneously being like flummoxed by this, of like, what is happening here, but also very moved, right? Like that this place that was built by these Irish folks in the 1860s has now become a place where all of these people can be. And I, with my sort of culturally vanilla upbringing, right? With no criticism to it, just like not having a distinctive national identity, I'm the person who have been entrusted to them, to be with them and to serve them. Is really beautiful. And then adding the dynamic onto that of having St. Joseph's Polish being part of this parish too. So then like having this very distinctive cultural dynamic, and getting to encounter people who have grown up here for generations, who, like you described, Father Jonathan, the Serdeczka Matko Catholics of like, this is the extent of my Polish, to then having other parishioners from Poland who were like part of the solidarity movement, right? Like, so it's just really a wild experience that has drawn me out of myself and has shown me in a way where like I have felt the like kind of longing in my heart for like not having had a distinctive cultural upbringing that way, to now like belong to all of these as the priest. And because of being a pastor entrusted to them, being welcomed into all of them has been just an overwhelmingly beautiful experience.
When I was serving as vocation director of the diocese back in 2019 to 23, but those last 2 years of that tenure, I was kind of put into a parish in Steelton, Pennsylvania, and it's a suburb immediately south of Harrisburg. It is a coal region parish in the middle of Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. It doesn't make any sense in its surrounding parishes, okay? But there were, in 95, before that, there were 5 parishes. But instead of what I experienced of the Slavs that we had, it was Slovenian, it was Austro, it was Germans from Hungary, from the Banat Valley, as well as other Germans. There were Italians, mostly practically all Calabrese. There was a territorial parish, the Irish parish, which was also traditionally African American. A freed slave was one of the founders of that parish in the 1870s. Okay, that was St. James. And the largest of the parishes in town was a Croatian parish. And sometimes it's interesting. Steelton's kind of famous in the church because of the mergers that the church merger, which became very contentious. There's jurisprudence of church mergers because of that church merger that is now affecting the Church Universal. Okay, I've been in other areas of the state, Pittsburgh, and I said Steelton, and they looked at us Croatians. I said, well, we're also famous for having a steel mill. The steel mill was still going at that time, But the thing is, when I got there, it wasn't just the old funeral hymn people who didn't want that taken away, although it was that. Okay. And this is the challenge for the hierarchy, is to actually listen to what the people are asking for. Because there were the old guard who might have wanted control. Maybe there was xenophobia. Maybe there was racism. Maybe. Okay. I wasn't there for that part. But definitely what was there was just a concern that they not be whitewashed, or that they just become another suburban parish without an identity. Okay. I was there for just shy of 2 years, first as administrator and then as pastor. Then I was moved over here to St. Teresa's. But within the first couple of months of serving there, and it was this interesting thing that I would say to some very active parishioners, I said, so this is they were from the old St. Mary's Croatian parish, but the last name is Navarro. Or no, the last name is Maroquin. They said, that's right. Well, the Maroquins went to the Croatian parish, the Navarros went to the Slovenian parish. I said, not to the territorial parish. Well, no. I said, well, why? I said, well, that's because they wanted to put their kids in the Croatian school or the Slovenian school. I said, oh, yeah, it makes perfect sense. There's no confusion there whatsoever. Okay. And then there was the African American funeral directors in town. Okay. And I met Mrs. Tate, and I said, oh, nice to meet you. She said, Father, I just want to let you know I am a proud alumna, and she even uses the correct Latin word. I'm a proud alumna of St. Mary's Croatian Catholic School and Precious Blood Sisters, St. Joseph's Academy in Columbia, Pennsylvania. I said, really? And she said, not bad for a Baptist. And she goes, a Black Baptist went to the Croatian. I said, I'm just trying to make this all sense in my head, Mrs. Tate. And I'm thinking, I go to a friend, and I said, so there's not as much racism as people are putting out to be. He said, well, no. And I said, so what's this whole thing about the mergers? I said, Father, they just didn't want to lose that heritage. It's like the difference almost between like a euthanasia and something just dying a natural death. Well, it came up, we had a funeral death of a Mexican immigrant man who has been in that community for decades. His children are all successful. But when I was talking with them, I said, so the funeral, and I said, how does your mom speak English? She goes, well, not really. She stayed at home. And they said, but Father, we're going to live stream this down to our family in Mexico. Father, can we have mariachi at this mass, this funeral mass? Now, I'm used to mariachi from when I was in York for funerals, weddings, quinceañeras, whatever. Yeah, go for it. But I said, let me just pray about this. I just don't want anything to blow up. Okay. So I talked to somebody, said, Father, I think you'll be fine. Okay. Then I said to the family, do you want me to do the canon of the Mass? Do you want me to do the guts of the Mass in Spanish? And they said, oh, we'd love that, Father. Our mom would love that. She'd be able to hear and understand, it's an intimate moment. Well, so I did this funeral in Spanish with a mariachi band. And one of those gentlemen who was one of the leaders of the protests against Bishop Nicholas Carmen de Tillo in 1995, one of the guys who marched in front of his residence every Thursday for 9 or 10 years. He got me when I was getting into the funeral lead car going to the cemetery. He goes, Father, I got to talk to you. And I said, oh, here we go. I'm going to get yelled at. The parishioner's going to rake me over the coals. Father, that was so beautiful. I said, really? And he said, this is just what we didn't want to lose when we had the merger. If the bishop just would have listened to us, this was so beautiful. You did Spanish. We're all immigrants here. Oh, there was Spanish. You do, I don't care what you, this is just wonderful. I'm thinking like, now he might have been waxing a little nostalgic about his openness to other, groups, but surrounded by stained glass windows with these Croatian names and place locations and society names. We did what the church asks us to do in accompanying people. Since I've left that parish 3 years ago now, there's now a colony of people from Burkina Faso, which is a Francophone African place where Christianity is persecuted. They're there. The Spanish are there. There's a once a month Croatian mass, and I began a priest coming up once a month from Washington, D.C., a Franciscan friar. Father Morris comes up and offers the liturgy once a month. And someone said to me, a friend of mine in Philadelphia said, is that really necessary, or is this just a walk down memory lane? I said, well, considering the people who I know who go to confession to him, and they're the Bosnian Croatians, whereas the ones who were part of the parish before 95, they were the funeral music people. Okay. Now these are the people who yearn to have a homily in their native tongue so they could fully understand. It's what the church asks us to do. It's what Jesus has asked us to do. And he said, go 2 by 2 and proclaim the kingdom to them. The Pentecost experience of speaking in tongues and each understand, it can be hard to understand. I did a home blessing in the 1 year, and Anto and Lilia, they were Croatians from Bosnia. And I sat in their house for like 50 minutes. And the thing is, they didn't really speak English, and I don't speak Croatian, but we managed to understand each other in the brokenness of the language, but just because you have to want to listen. And sometimes the church kind of has sometimes been slow of, well, we have our central planning. We know what the census says. I've been one to take a screenshot of a Spanish church, which is doing some type of servicio in an old Protestant church in Mount Carmel, saying, hey, they're here. Are we going to minister to them? Do we have someone to send that maybe we don't lose more people to the evangelical communities? They'll let us know they're here. They not tell us, but they'll show us. And what are we doing to respond to those needs of the immigrants today?
I'm really blown away by both your guys talking about this. And it's such a privilege to know priests like you, and part of the ministry of this is to get sentiments and discussion like this out to as many people as possible. And so kind of going back a little bit, Father Jonathan, about how you were saying like your perception of ministry and the Hispanic world being, kind of your background, but then also the church that we have today, which is there are suburban parishes where there's a priest who walks in who speaks broken English and who's not going to pick up on a lot of things. They're not going to be, able to get a priest like either of you to minister them. And sometimes that tribalism, that closed-mindedness might come out in an ugly way. I'm curious, well, two things. One, what kind of is your response to that sort of a community? And then also, how can those of us who do know priests like you that are active in the church that have, and I think what we're getting close to and we're talking about too is in a lot of ways the synodal, sense that it was, kind of not inaugurated, but perpetuated by the late Pope Francis of really, administering and listening to people. And there is, there's a lot of many difficult feelings about the church, but there's also kind of been this youth resurgence. There's a lot going on right now. I'm just curious about that. What can we do to kind of support you in your beautiful ministries? But also, how do you outreach to people that are sort of like that?
Well, I would say with regard to the people who maybe have a little bit of that closed-mindedness is, I guess I would encourage them to listen to the entirety of the story of people. Like to get out of the mass setting and get to know this priest and ask, Father, how did you grow up? Because I'll admit, I've been there too. My family members are also like that sometimes. When you get to mass for your normal 10 o'clock English mass and the priest from India or from Vietnam is processing in, you're like, oh great, not going to understand the homily here. And I remember one time as a young seminarian getting to know one of the priests in our diocese from Vietnam. Actually, our vocation director had invited him to come and speak to us, to share a little bit of his testimony of how did you get here? And the story he told us, I was captivated, absolutely captivated, because he basically talked about how his family, for fear of persecution, got into a rowboat, rowed out of the river in Vietnam into the open ocean in the hope that some bigger ship would pick them up, which they did. Some kind of, freight liner picked up their family and brought them to California. And one thing happened after another that led them to New Jersey. And now this is the priest celebrating Mass in suburban South Jersey. While his accent is still hard to understand, right? Knowing that, when I see that priest process in, what my thought is now is he came here and wants to serve me, and while there's obviously some human difficulties and obstacles then, and all right, what exactly is he saying? It changes the fundamental disposition of okay, you're here to serve me. And I think just knowing the story of anyone can fill the heart with empathy that leads to a greater receptivity to the person, that then you might even realize oh, I'm actually understanding more than I think I do. Whereas if before I might just kind of turn off mentally when I just have a presupposition or a prejudice there. So I think my invitation to a lot of people would be know the story of the person. And then to us as well, if I feel fear or apprehension toward people of a certain culture, is when you give them the space to share, how did you get here? What is the background? It just leads to a lot of walls kind of crashing down that open things up a lot.
When you're focused on a person, we all have red blood, okay? We all like to eat. We all like to laugh. But when you dehumanize, when you fail to see the humanity of someone, you're gonna find yourself not liking someone easily. But when you humanize someone, when you do the reverse, and let's face it, folks, we really need to rehumanize society in the United States. We really need to see each other not as a category or a tribe, but as persons. And it's number one, it's just better for our mental well-being, and it's better for our soul because we're loving rather than being angry or judging. So I think that what Father Stephen said exactly right. Just see the person, and you see some really heroic life experiences that we could really tap into. So when I got moved here 3 years ago, my current assignment, and this is, there's a danger in some people, and this, please don't misunderstand. This was sometimes called the West Shore of Harrisburg, the west side of the Susquehanna River. Some people would say, "Oh, you're moving to the White Shore," and there was real, some bigotry. The night before the first Sunday Mass in 1928 of this parish, the Klan marched and burned a cross on the front lawn of that house, which was our temporary chapel. Now, I had a chuckle about this last summer because typically I'm hearing Spanish confessions at least once a week. A lot of the Latinos who are in this community are bilingual, so they'll go to, sometimes they'll say, "You want to talk in Spanish? Oh, okay, well, puedes hablarlo?" Whatever. And but even here, last summer, we had a Burmese wedding. And so complete with swords and coin purses, and I'm thinking like, I don't know what's going on here, but we're going to get through it and we're going to smile. Because we have several Burmese, families from Myanmar, and they are, again, persecuted Christians. But like, my gosh, this is so cool. Like, and they also work the sushi counter at most of the giant food stores in the area. And so they spot you and say, "Father, I don't even eat sushi." They're giving you freebies.
Funny. That's funny. Yeah. And and to bring it home a little bit, I think about that. There's this great quote that I love from St. John Paul II, the great Polish son, of how darkness can only be scattered by light. Hatred can only be conquered by love. And, that sense of humanizing people, like you said, when you get to know someone, we all do bleed red.
I think kind of as is the case with all of, like, in the priestly world and religious world, that people talk about the promise of obedience being very difficult sometimes. And when you talk to any like veteran priest or religious who've been at this for a long time, that whenever you're asked to do something that you're not excited about, God has a habit of drawing us out of ourselves and blessing us very abundantly in ways that we don't expect. And I think in this realm of like serving people of other cultures, which is never something I necessarily, when I first heard the call to be a priest, would have imagined being something that I desired for myself. And even after like seeking to learn the Spanish language, then like being asked to do different things at different moments as a priest, you're kind of like, oh boy, what the heck? Like, I'm not going to have anything to offer these people, like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go there. I think that specifically with regard to like ministering to people of different cultural backgrounds and different nations of origin has been one of the most abundantly grace-filled aspects of my short time as a priest. So I offer that just for any of us, I think, that not even just in the priestly religious world, but whenever we're confronted by another culture that maybe initially does not seem like something exciting to us, or something that we want to engage with or learn about or be open to, that when we do have like the willingness, even if like calling that obedience isn't the proper way of talking about it, anytime there's this like openness of heart to receive others of another place or culture or like way of being, God blesses us very abundantly in that. And so I hope that anyone who might be experiencing that in whatever state of life they might be, is receptive to the graces that God could be desiring to give them through.
When we see the need, what does the Lord ask of us? You go back to the Old Testament, where people were in a foreign land, and, remember, you yourselves were once slaves in Egypt. Do not forget where you came from and who brought you out of there. Okay, that was the lesson to Israel, and that's the lesson then to us today, that someone was there. And even in the Mount Carmel, learning the history of the church in my hometown, your ancestral Pennsylvania homeland. There's other instances, okay, where Father Leopold Stein, who was assigned to the Polish parishes, but he was a German convert, to Catholicism. And people were upset that he was there, but imagine he was thinking, like, I'm out of my element. But he was sent, and good came from that. There's a beautiful history of the Slovak church at Mount Carmel in the 1930s, because, I mean, the Slovak immigrant group was considerably smaller than the Polish immigrant group in the United States. However, if we talk about punching above their weight class, and I think, with the orphanage that they had, the Slovak Catholic Union had in Middletown, Jednota, as well as the Sisters of St. Cyril Methodius, tremendous reach for what was considerably a small ethnicity. Nonetheless, they had an Irish pastor at the Slovak church at Mount Carmel back in the 1930s. And knowing the histories that I would read as a young person, I think it was Father Lawler or Father Lawley. Anyway, it talked about his first, because Mass was in Latin, but the devotions were in the vernacular, and about how he'd be perspiring his way through the Lenten devotions in order to try to read this to the best of his ability for the people. And the first time I was leading Stations of the Cross in Gettysburg, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm that guy. Okay? But it's what the Lord asks of us. And we're not prosperity preachers wanting to, get a better tax bracket and nicer homes. We're meant to go into a place, and this is true poverty of spirit. Go to a place that isn't ours, or, among people who aren't ours, and then seeing God's providential care. And if there's a young person considering a priestly vocation or a religious vocation, think of this. And did Thomas really want to go to India? Did Andrew really want to go up to what would become Constantinople? But they went. Did Peter really want to get crucified upside down? Probably not, but he went. Okay, the least we could do is learn a pocos palabras para servir la misa a la gente, right? It's really good. And, if you do this, you'll never go hungry because they'll just feed you.
Amen.
It's like one of our Polish families here at St. Teresa's. Like, I love it when I see them walking up this path to the rectory. I see Maggie and Rafał. Is that real pierogi, not Polish American pierogi? This is the real stuff in the red beet soup. Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I know Father Stephen has experienced that firsthand. And also, it was funny. So we did Goshkajala this year, and and this is the thing, but I really admire Father Steve for, putting himself out there and him trying to do Polish. But they appreciate it because it's just that recognition that you're seen, I think, is really what it comes down to. Yeah, it really does. I think that is. It's just that sort of respecting the humanity and respecting the person's needs. And that's where true conversion kind of happens, and true respect, regardless.
I like what you said. They realize they're seen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Seen and heard. Synodal.
Yeah.
I hope that our episode today has left you with many things to ponder. Not only how we seek to preserve the heritage of our ancestors in very concrete ways, such as sharing our traditions and restoring our beautiful churches, but also how we understand the needs and faith of a newer generation and newcomers of different backgrounds. This may be an especially relevant question, as in this month of July, we commemorate the 250th birthday of the nation, and we pause to consider what it is that has defined us over the centuries, but also how we learn from the good and the bad of its history to improve the well-being for future generations. The questions of immigration are a legacy and a challenge that spans all societal elements, from religion and education to politics and government, and we can respond to it in a variety of ways. On our podcast and through our apostolate, we hope to bring an encounter with our Polish heritage, yet also how it is rooted so often in our Catholic faith. It is in that universal faith tradition that we are called to recognize, in this multi-ethnic, diverse land in which we find ourselves, how we respond to the true challenge of that faith. In much the same way that I myself do not actually have ties to St. Joseph's in Camden, but have nonetheless felt welcomed due to my shared experience of this faith, we constantly provide that same welcome and that same home to anyone who may wish to seek it out. Until next time, saute some pierogi and sit with a saint. And this month, we wish you a very happy and safe 4th of July. Thank you, dziękujemy, and do usłyszenia.